Sometimes the family you lose finds its way back to you in the most unexpected ways. For 30 years, Silas Boone has lived alone in the Montana mountains, carrying the weight of a daughter who vanished without a trace. His only companions are his sled dogs and the endless silence of the wilderness. When his lead hound suddenly bolts from camp one evening, racing into the deep woods, Silas follows. What he finds changes everything he thought he knew about survival and second chances. A wild girl, barely 16, moves through the forest like she was born to it. She doesn't speak with words, but his dogs understand her perfectly. She's been living with a wolf pack since she was just a baby. Now Silas faces an impossible choice: bring her back to a world that will never accept her, or leave her in the wilderness where she belongs. But what if saving her is the only way to save himself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine needles, like memories that refused to fade, and Silas Boone moved through it with the careful grace of a man who'd learned to read the forest's moods better than any human heart. His weathered hands, scarred by decades of mountain living, gripped the hand-carved wooden whistle that hung from a leather cord around his neck. Made from mountain ash and worn smooth by 30 years of use, the whistle had called his dogs through blizzards, avalanches, and the kind of silence that could drive a lesser man to madness. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, its log walls chinked tight against the coming winter. Silas had built it with his own hands, choosing each timber with the patience of a man who understood that in the wilderness, second chances were rare as summer snow. The roof sloped steep to shed the heavy Montana winters, and a stone chimney promised warmth when the world turned white and unforgiving. Around the cabin, the practical necessities of mountain life spoke to his solitary existence: a smokehouse for preserving meat, a woodshed stacked high with split pine and fir, and the dog yard where his team of 8 Alaskan huskies waited with the eager patience of creatures born to run. Rex, his lead dog, stood apart from the others with the natural authority of a born leader. The big male's coat was silver-gray, with darker guard hairs that caught the morning light, his blue eyes alert and intelligent. Silas had found Rex as a pup, half frozen and abandoned on a mountain trail 12 years ago. Now the dog could read Silas's intentions before the man himself knew what he planned to do. Behind Rex, the other 7 dogs formed their own small society. Mabel, the steady wheel dog with her amber eyes and unwavering loyalty. Ghost and Shadow, the twin brothers who ran in perfect synchronization. Luna, the only female besides Mabel, fierce and protective. Tracker, whose nose could follow a scent 3 days old. Bear, massive and gentle despite his intimidating size. And Finn, the youngest at 3 years old, still eager to prove himself worthy of the team. Each morning began the same way it had for 3 decades. Silas would step onto his porch, breathe in the mountain air that tasted of pine resin and snow promise, and survey his domain. The nearest neighbor lived 47 miles away in Timber Creek, a ramshackle collection of buildings that served the scattered ranchers, miners, and trappers who chose this hard life over the easy comforts of civilization. Silas made the journey to town maybe 4 times a year, trading furs and buying supplies, but he never lingered. The chatter of townsfolk felt foreign after months of speaking only to his dogs, and their curious glances reminded him of questions he'd spent decades avoiding. Before the mountains claimed him, Silas had been a different man entirely. 28 years old, married to Sarah, a school teacher with gentle hands and a laugh that could light up the darkest winter evening. They'd lived in a white house with blue shutters on the outskirts of Great Falls, and their daughter Maggie had filled that house with the kind of joy that makes a man believe the world is fundamentally good. Maggie had been 7 when she disappeared, vanishing between the schoolhouse and home on a September afternoon that started ordinary and ended with Silas's world cracking apart like ice in a spring thaw. The search had consumed him. For 3 years, he'd followed every lead, questioned every stranger, walked every trail within 100 miles of Great Falls. Sarah had begged him to stop, to grieve and heal and maybe try for another child. But Silas couldn't rest while his little girl might be out there somewhere, waiting for her daddy to find her. The marriage couldn't survive his obsession, and Sarah had left him on a cold February morning, taking nothing but a single suitcase and the photograph of Maggie that usually sat on the mantelpiece. The mountains had called to him then, offering the kind of solitude where a broken man could either heal or disappear entirely. Silas had chosen something in between. He'd learned to trap and hunt, to read weather in the wind and find direction by the stars. The dogs had come one by one, strays and cast-offs that recognized in him a kindred spirit. Together, they'd built a life measured not in calendar pages, but in the rhythm of seasons. The migration of game and the slow accumulation of small comforts that made survival feel almost like living. In his shirt pocket, pressed close to his heart, Silas carried the last photograph of Maggie, a faded daguerreotype taken on her 6th birthday. She wore a white dress with tiny flowers embroidered on the collar, her dark hair in careful braids, her smile bright with the confidence of a child who believed her father could fix anything. Sometimes, on the longest winter nights, he'd take out that photograph and wonder what she would look like now. Whether she'd grown tall like her mother, or kept the stubborn chin that marked her as his daughter. The dogs knew his moods better than any human ever had. On the days when grief sat heavy on his shoulders, they'd press close without being asked, offering the wordless comfort that only creatures who understood loss could provide. They'd seen him through pneumonia and a broken leg, through the kind of despair that made a man consider walking into a blizzard and not coming back. In return, Silas had given them purpose, direction, and the kind of love that asked for nothing but loyalty in return. This morning felt different, though. Rex had been restless since before dawn, whining softly and pacing the length of his chain. The other dogs picked up on their leader's anxiety, shifting and stirring in ways that spoke of some disturbance Silas couldn't yet identify. He'd learned to trust their instincts above his own. They could smell weather changes hours before the sky showed signs, hear the approach of strangers long before human ears caught the sound. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked, running his fingers through Rex's thick coat. The dog pressed against his leg, then pulled away toward the tree line, every muscle tense with focused attention. "Is something out there bothering you?" The forest spread before them in every direction, a vast tapestry of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and aspen that had stood here long before the first white man set foot in Montana territory. Silas knew these woods like a sailor knows his charts, could navigate by starlight through terrain that would confuse a surveyor. But lately, even he'd noticed signs of something unusual, tracks that didn't quite match any animal he recognized. Caches of meat hung high in trees using techniques no human should know, and an odd sense of being watched during his daily rounds. The morning routine continued despite Rex's agitation. Silas checked each dog, examining paws for cuts, feeling for any signs of illness or injury. He refilled their water bowls from the spring that bubbled up behind the cabin, blessing this place with the one necessity that made mountain living possible. The spring had never failed in 30 years, running clear and cold even in the driest summers, a gift from the deep earth that Silas never took for granted. Breakfast was simple, coffee black as creek bottom, sourdough bread toasted over the coals, and strips of venison jerky that would keep him going through the day. He ate standing on the porch, watching the mist rise from the valley below as the sun crested the eastern peaks. This was his church, his daily communion with forces larger and more reliable than human promises. The mountains didn't lie or disappoint. They simply were, eternal and indifferent, offering sanctuary to those strong enough to meet their terms. As the morning wore on, Rex's restlessness infected the entire team. Even Bear, normally as steady as granite, began pacing and whining. Silas had seen this behavior before storms, but the sky showed no signs of weather. The barometer hung steady, and the wind carried only the familiar scents of pine sap and decomposing leaves. Whatever had disturbed his dogs lay beyond the reach of his human senses. By afternoon, Silas had made his decision. He'd take Rex and investigate whatever was causing the disturbance. The other dogs could guard the cabin and wait for their return. It wouldn't be the first time he'd followed his lead dog's instincts into unknown territory, and Rex had never led him astray. The big husky had an uncanny ability to sense danger, find game, and navigate through terrain that challenged even Silas's mountain-born skills. He prepared carefully, as mountain living had taught him to do. The rifle went across his shoulders, a .30-06 that had dropped elk and black bear with equal efficiency. His pack held the essentials: rope, knife, fire-starting materials, emergency food, and a basic medical kit. The wooden whistle hung ready at his throat, capable of calling Rex back from a mile away if necessary. In the mountains, preparation meant the difference between adventure and tragedy, and Silas had survived too long to take unnecessary chances. As evening approached, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rex's agitation reached a crescendo. The dog stood at the edge of the clearing, every fiber of his being focused on something beyond the tree line. His hackles weren't raised, which ruled out immediate danger. But his intensity suggested something significant waited in the gathering dusk. "All right, boy," Silas said, his voice calm despite the strange anticipation building in his chest. "Show me what's got you so worked up." He unclipped Rex's chain, and the dog immediately bounded toward the forest, pausing only to ensure Silas followed. Together, they stepped into the deepening shadows between the trees, leaving behind the familiar safety of the clearing for whatever mystery waited in the wild heart of the Montana mountains. Behind them, the other dogs whined and paced, but Silas had made his choice. Some instinct older than civilization told him that whatever lay ahead would change everything. The way a single falling stone can trigger an avalanche that reshapes an entire mountainside. The wooden whistle bumped against his chest with each step, a reminder of the bond between man and dog that had sustained him through 30 years of solitude. Now that bond was leading him into unknown territory, following a trail only Rex could detect toward a discovery that would challenge everything Silas thought he knew about survival, family, and the possibility of second chances in a world that rarely offered them. Rex moved through the forest with purpose that bordered on desperation, his powerful shoulders working as he navigated deadfall and underbrush with the fluid grace of a creature born to this terrain. Silas followed, his boots finding purchase on moss-slick rocks and fallen logs, reading the forest floor with eyes trained by 3 decades of mountain living. The familiar weight of his rifle across his shoulders provided comfort, but something in Rex's behavior suggested this wouldn't be a conventional encounter with the wildlife that shared these ancient woods. The scent hit Rex. First, Silas could see it in the way the dog's entire body went rigid, his black nose working frantically to process information that defied his canine understanding. Whatever lay ahead carried familiar elements mixed with something entirely foreign, a combination that both attracted and confused the experienced sled dog. Rex whined softly, a sound Silas had never heard from his normally confident leader, then pressed forward with renewed urgency. They climbed steadily through terrain Silas recognized but rarely visited, a section of forest where the trees grew taller and the undergrowth thicker, creating a canopy so dense that even afternoon sunlight filtered down in scattered beams. Ancient Douglas firs rose like cathedral columns, their bark scarred by decades of weather and wildlife, their crowns lost in shadows that seemed to hold secrets older than human memory. This was old forest, the kind that had witnessed the passage of native hunting parties, the struggles of early trappers, and now the daily dramas of creatures who lived and died without human witness. The first sign of something unusual was subtle, a broken branch at exactly the right height for human passage, snapped cleanly rather than torn by wind or animal activity. Silas paused to examine it, noting the way the break faced, the freshness of the exposed wood. Someone or something had passed this way recently, moving with deliberate intent rather than the random wandering of forest animals. Rex sniffed the area intensely, his tail rigid with concentration, then pushed deeper into the undergrowth. 50 yards further, Silas found the second sign, a piece of torn blue fabric caught on a blackberry thorn, faded and weathered but unmistakably human in origin. The cloth felt rough between his fingers, like homespun cotton that had endured seasons of exposure to mountain weather. It was small, perhaps torn from a sleeve or hem, but its presence here in the deep forest raised questions that made Silas's chest tighten with possibilities he didn't dare voice. Rex had gone completely silent now, moving with the stalking precision of a wolf approaching uncertain prey. His ears swiveled constantly, processing sounds beyond human hearing, while his nose worked to decode a scent story that grew more complex with each step. Silas matched his dog's caution, placing each foot carefully to avoid the snap of twigs or the rustle of dry leaves that might announce their approach to whatever waited ahead. The forest began to change as they climbed higher, opening into natural clearings, where mountain meadows created pockets of grassland between the towering conifers. Here elk trails crisscrossed the landscape, worn deep by generations of animals following the ancient routes between feeding and watering areas. But mixed with the sharp-hooved prints of elk and deer, Silas began to notice other tracks, canine prints too large for coyotes, too varied for a single wolf pack, and most disturbing of all, the unmistakable impression of a bare human foot in a patch of soft earth beside a stream. Rex froze at the edge of the next clearing, his entire body coiled like a spring. Silas crouched beside his dog, following the animal's intense gaze across the open space to where the tree line resumed on the far side. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar interplay of light and shadow that marked the boundary between meadow and forest. Then movement caught his eye, fluid, careful, utterly unlike the purposeful progression of any animal he knew. A figure emerged from the shadows with the cautious grace of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. At first glance, Silas thought it might be a young deer, the way it moved with that combination of alertness and economy that marked all successful forest dwellers. But as his eyes adjusted and focused, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, though judging age seemed impossible when everything about her defied normal human development. Her hair hung in matted tangles past her shoulders, dark brown, streaked with premature grey that spoke of harsh winters and harder living. Her skin was darkened by constant exposure to sun and weather, marked with scars that told stories of survival in an environment that showed no mercy to the unprepared. But it was her eyes that stopped Silas's breath entirely, alert, intelligent, and utterly wild, scanning her surroundings with the practiced wariness of a predator who was also prey. She wore what appeared to be clothing, though calling it that stretched the definition to its breaking point. Animal skins had been sewn together with sinew or plant fiber, creating a garment that covered her modestly while allowing the freedom of movement necessary for forest life. Her feet were bare, the soles thick and calloused from years of walking on stones, roots, and frozen ground. Most remarkably, she moved without sound, placing each step with the kind of precision that took most humans years to develop. Behind her, emerging from the forest like living shadows, came the pack. Silas counted 6 animals, though their exact nature remained unclear in the dappled light. They were too large for coyotes, too varied in color and build for wolves, yet they moved with the coordinated purpose of a hunting pack that had worked together for years. Their coats ranged from silver gray to russet brown to pure black, and their eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth and complexity. The girl moved among them with complete confidence, occasionally reaching out to touch one or another as they passed, receiving gentle nudges and soft whines in response. There was no question about the relationship. She was part of their pack as surely as they were part of hers, accepted and protected with the fierce loyalty that marked successful predator groups. When she paused at the center of the clearing, they arranged themselves around her in a loose circle, some facing outward to watch for threats, others focused entirely on her, as if awaiting some signal or command. Rex whined again, that same confused sound Silas had heard earlier, and the entire pack across the clearing froze. The girl's head snapped toward their hiding place with startling speed, her nostrils flaring as she tested the air. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator stared at predator across 50 yards of open meadow, each group assessing the threat level of the other. Then the girl made a sound unlike anything Silas had ever heard, part whistle, part growl, entirely inhuman yet unmistakably communicative. Her pack responded instantly, flowing into defensive positions, with the fluid precision of water finding its level. But instead of aggression, Silas sensed curiosity, the kind of cautious interest that marked intelligent creatures encountering something new and potentially significant. Rex trembled beside him, every instinct at war with every other. The sled dog's breeding told him these were potential rivals, competitors for territory and resources. But something deeper, perhaps the memory of pack life that lived in the bones of every canine, recognized kinship in the coordinated group across the meadow. His tail wagged once, uncertainly, then stilled as confusion overwhelmed his normal confidence. The girl took a step forward, then another, her pack flowing with her like extensions of her own body. She moved toward them, with the fearless curiosity of a creature that had never learned to be afraid of humans, because she had never truly been human herself. Her eyes fixed on Rex rather than Silas, recognizing the dog as the more immediate presence, the one whose intentions would determine the nature of this encounter. Silas found himself holding his breath, afraid that any movement might shatter this impossible moment and send the girl fleeing back into the deep forest where she might disappear forever. In her face, in the way she held herself, in the careful intelligence of her movements, he saw echoes of something he had lost so long ago it felt like another man's memory. The protective instincts that had driven him to search for 3 years, that had brought him to these mountains to either heal or die, stirred to life with painful intensity. Here was a child who had survived impossible odds, who had found family and purpose in the wilderness that most humans considered hostile and unforgiving. Here was proof that sometimes the lost could indeed be found, that adaptation and love could overcome circumstances that should have meant death. And here was a choice that would define the rest of his life: approach or withdraw, interfere or observe, risk everything on the possibility that this wild girl might be the second chance he had never dared hope for. Rex made the decision for him, rising slowly and stepping into the clearing with his head high and tail neutral, offering neither threat nor submission. Across the meadow, the wild pack watched his approach with the kind of intense focus that preceded either violence or acceptance, while the girl who had somehow survived among them waited to see what these strange newcomers would bring to her carefully ordered world. Rex's approach across the meadow unfolded with the careful diplomacy of creatures who understood that first impressions could mean the difference between alliance and bloodshed. The big husky moved with deliberate slowness, his body language speaking a universal canine language that transcended the boundaries between domestic and wild. His ears remained forward but relaxed, his tail held at a neutral angle that suggested neither dominance nor submission, just honest curiosity about these strange relatives who had chosen a different path. The wild pack responded with their own careful choreography. The largest male, a silver-gray animal with the intelligent eyes of a born leader, stepped forward to match Rex's advance. They met in the center of the meadow with the formal dignity of diplomats from different nations, circling each other once before touching noses in the ancient greeting that spoke of respect, if not yet trust. The other pack members maintained their positions but relaxed slightly, accepting their leader's assessment that these newcomers posed no immediate threat. Through it all, the girl watched with an intensity that made Silas's chest tighten with recognition. She studied Rex's every movement, cataloging his responses and filing away information with the sharp intelligence of someone whose survival had always depended on reading the subtle communications of pack dynamics. When Rex's tail wagged once in friendly acknowledgement of the wild pack's acceptance, she nodded slightly, as if confirming some internal assessment of his character. From his position at the tree line, Silas observed this interspecies diplomacy with growing amazement. The girl's integration with her pack wasn't the crude dominance relationship he might have expected, but something far more sophisticated, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding. She moved among the animals with the fluid confidence of someone who belonged completely, occasionally placing a hand on a furry shoulder or exchanging what could only be described as conversational sounds with individual pack members. Deciding that Rex had successfully established the peaceful nature of their presence, Silas stepped into the clearing himself. The reaction was immediate and telling. The wild pack tensed, their attention shifting from friendly curiosity to wary assessment, while the girl took several quick steps backward. Her posture changed entirely, from relaxed confidence to the coiled readiness of a creature prepared to flee or fight, depending on how this new threat developed. Silas stopped where he was, understanding instinctively that pushing forward would only increase her fear. Instead, he settled slowly to the ground, making himself smaller and less intimidating while keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd learned from years of working with spooked animals that patience achieved more than pressure, that trust was something earned through consistency rather than demanded through force. "Easy, girl," he said softly, his voice carrying the same calm tone he used with frightened dogs or injured wildlife. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The sound of his voice triggered another fascinating response. The girl's head tilted slightly, and she made a series of soft clicking sounds that brought her pack closer, not in aggression, but in protective curiosity. She was trying to process this new form of communication. These patterns of sound that clearly carried meaning, but fell outside her experience of how creatures talk to each other. Over the following hour, Silas learned more about survival and adaptation than 30 years of mountain living had taught him. The girl's daily existence was a masterclass in wilderness skills that would have impressed the most experienced woodsman. She moved through her territory with the confident knowledge of someone who understood every plant, every animal track, every shift in weather pattern that might affect her pack's welfare. When one of the younger pack members brought her a rabbit it had caught, she accepted it with a series of grateful sounds. Then began the complex process of sharing the meal according to hierarchies and needs that she understood perfectly. Using a bone needle she produced from some hidden pocket in her makeshift clothing, she carefully divided the meat, ensuring the nursing female received the choicest portions while the older male who had done the actual hunting was honored with the second-best pieces. The bone needle itself was a revelation, carved from what appeared to be deer antler, sharpened to a fine point and polished smooth by constant use. Sinew thread, carefully prepared and twisted, allowed her to perform delicate work that would have challenged a skilled seamstress. This wasn't crude survival, but sophisticated craftsmanship developed over years of necessity and refined through constant practice. Silas watched her work and felt his understanding of her situation shift dramatically. This wasn't a lost child who had somehow managed to stay alive through luck and stubbornness. This was a fully adapted human being who had created a complete life within the framework of pack society, developing skills and relationships that served her needs while honoring the social structures that kept her family unit functioning. As evening approached, the girl's pack began displaying behaviors that spoke of established routines and territorial knowledge. They moved through the clearing in patterns that suggested this was a regular stopping point, a safe area where they could rest and feed without concern for predators or territorial disputes. The girl participated in these patterns with the unconscious ease of long practice, checking scent markers, testing the wind direction, and positioning herself where she could monitor the most likely approach routes for potential threats. When the silver-gray pack leader settled beside a fallen log and began the grooming, behaviors that marked the transition from travel to rest, the girl joined him without hesitation. She ran her fingers through his thick coat with the practiced movements of someone who understood the social importance of mutual care within pack structures. The big animal leaned into her touch with obvious pleasure, his eyes closing in the complete trust that marked truly bonded relationships. Silas found himself thinking of Maggie, of the way his daughter had moved through their house with that same unconscious confidence, secure in her place within a family structure that provided both love and safety. The parallel was almost too painful to contemplate, but it was impossible to ignore. This girl had found what every child needed, a family that accepted her completely, protected her fiercely, and gave her life meaning and purpose. Rex, emboldened by the pack's acceptance, had gradually moved closer to the group. Now he lay at the edge of their circle, not quite part of their family, but no longer an outsider either. His presence seemed to fascinate the girl, who kept glancing his way with expressions that mixed curiosity with something that might have been longing. Perhaps some deep memory of human-canine partnerships stirred in her consciousness, awakening associations she couldn't quite articulate, as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Silas made his first careful attempt at more direct communication. He pulled a piece of jerky from his pack and held it out toward the girl, not approaching but simply making the offering available. She studied his gesture for long minutes, clearly understanding the intent while weighing the risks of accepting food from this strange bipedal creature who seemed connected to the familiar dog but remained otherwise incomprehensible. The decision, when it came, surprised him with its dignity. She approached slowly, her pack maintaining protective positions around her, and accepted the jerky with a formal nod that spoke of social awareness far beyond what he had expected. She examined the dried meat carefully, testing its scent and texture before taking a small bite. Her expression shifted to one of pleased surprise. This was food prepared by methods she didn't understand, but flavored in ways that appealed to her palate. That small exchange, the sharing of food between strangers who were learning to trust, marked the beginning of a relationship that would challenge everything Silas thought he knew about family, civilization, and the possibilities for healing that existed even in the deepest wilderness. As he settled in for what would clearly be a night spent in her territory, he wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or taking the first step toward redemption he had thought was lost forever. The night passed in a symphony of forest sounds that told stories only the girl seemed to fully understand. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl, every crack of settling timber carried information she processed with the unconscious competence of someone whose life depended on reading the wilderness like a vast living book. Silas dozed fitfully, his mountain-trained senses alert to the unusual situation, while Rex slept peacefully for the first time in days, apparently satisfied that they had found what they had been seeking. Dawn revealed the girl's morning routine with stark clarity. She rose before first light, moving through a series of stretches and exercises that spoke of years spent maintaining the physical condition necessary for survival in unforgiving terrain. Her makeshift fur cloak, sewn together from the pelts of various animals, shifted and flowed with her movements like a second skin. The garment was more sophisticated than Silas had initially realized. Each piece of fur had been carefully selected for its properties, with water-resistant outer layers and insulating inner sections that created a remarkably effective protection against mountain weather. The cloak itself was a testament to her resourcefulness and skill. Bear fur formed the primary structure, providing both warmth and durability, while rabbit pelts lined the interior for softness against her skin. Strategic patches of deer hide reinforced areas that would receive the most wear, and the entire garment was bound together with sinew stitching so fine it could have come from an experienced seamstress. Most remarkably, she had incorporated practical elements that spoke of deep understanding of wilderness needs, hidden pockets for tools, loops for carrying equipment, and a hood designed to protect against both rain and snow while maintaining peripheral vision. Her pack moved with her through their morning activities, each animal following routines that had clearly been established over years of shared living. The nursing female checked on cubs hidden somewhere in the nearby rocks, while the older males patrolled the perimeter of their temporary territory. The girl participated in these activities as naturally as breathing, contributing her human intelligence to pack strategies while accepting her place within hierarchies that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with competence and trust. Silas watched her interact with the young pack member that couldn't have been more than 2 years old, barely past puppyhood, but already showing the intelligence and independence that marked this particular group. She knelt beside the animal and began what could only be described as a lesson, using gestures and sounds to teach hunting techniques that combined canine instincts with human problem-solving abilities. The young one's eager attention and quick responses suggested this kind of interspecies education was a regular part of their community life. When she became aware of Silas's observation, the girl paused in her teaching and studied him with those remarkably intelligent eyes. Something in her expression suggested she was trying to categorize him within frameworks that had served her well but didn't quite account for this strange creature who seemed connected to dogs but behaved unlike any animal she knew. Her pack sensed her uncertainty and moved closer, not threateningly but protectively, ready to respond to whatever decision she made about this ongoing intrusion into their territory. Silas decided to take a calculated risk. Moving slowly and deliberately, he pulled out his wooden whistle and held it where she could see it clearly. Her reaction was immediate and fascinating. Her head tilted in the universal gesture of curiosity, and she made a series of soft sounds that brought her pack to alert attention. The whistle represented something beyond her experience, but clearly related to the communication methods she understood. When he brought the whistle to his lips and produced a single, clear note, the effect was electric. Rex responded instantly, moving to Silas's side with trained precision while the wild pack froze in positions that spoke of intense interest rather than alarm. The girl's eyes widened and she took several steps closer, clearly struggling to understand how a small piece of carved wood could produce sounds that commanded such immediate response from an intelligent animal. Silas repeated the demonstration, this time using the specific whistle pattern that meant come in the language he had developed with his team over years of mountain travel. Rex performed a perfect recall, sitting at attention beside his handler while maintaining awareness of the wild pack's reactions. The girl circled them both, studying this display of interspecies communication with the focused intensity of someone trying to decode a completely new form of language. Her own attempts at mimicking the whistle sounds were surprisingly successful. Within minutes, she had produced recognizable approximations of Silas's basic commands, though her pack responded with confusion rather than Rex's trained obedience. The difference seemed to frustrate her, and she looked between Rex and her own animals with expressions that suggested she was beginning to understand that different relationships produced different kinds of communication and cooperation. The breakthrough came when Silas demonstrated the whistle pattern for stay, backing away from Rex while the dog remained in perfect position despite the obvious temptation to follow. The girl watched this display of trust and voluntary cooperation with growing excitement, finally making sounds of understanding that brought her pack clustering around her in what appeared to be urgent conversation. Their exchange involved complex vocalizations, physical gestures, and scent-marking behaviors that clearly constituted sophisticated communication, though it operated on principles entirely different from human-canine training relationships. By midday, she had become bold enough to approach Rex directly, though she maintained careful awareness of Silas's position and reactions. Her first tentative touch to Rex's fur produced a tail wag that seemed to surprise and delight her, and soon she was examining the big husky with the thorough attention of someone learning about a completely new form of life. Rex tolerated her investigation with patient dignity, somehow understanding that this strange human raised by wolves needed to satisfy her curiosity before any real relationship could develop. The afternoon brought the first real test of the fragile trust building between them. A sudden thunderstorm moved through the area with the violent intensity that marked mountain weather, bringing driving rain and lightning that turned the forest into a place of danger and confusion. Silas's immediate instinct was to seek shelter, but the girl's reaction taught him something profound about her relationship with her environment. Instead of fleeing the storm, she and her pack moved to a rocky overhang that provided protection while maintaining visibility of their surroundings. She had clearly chosen this spot through experience rather than panic, understanding that mountain storms demanded respect but didn't necessarily require retreat. Her pack arranged themselves according to some predetermined plan that kept the most vulnerable members protected while positioning the strongest where they could respond to emergencies. Silas found himself invited into this shelter through gestures that were unmistakably welcoming, the first time the girl had actively included him in her pack's protective behaviors. As they waited out the storm together, listening to thunder echo through the valleys below, he began to understand that bringing her back to civilization would mean asking her to abandon not just a way of life, but a family that had given her everything she needed to become a complete, confident, and remarkably capable human being. The question that haunted him as the storm passed and normal forest sounds resumed was whether he had any right to disrupt a life that worked so well, simply because it didn't conform to human expectations of how children should be raised and where they should belong. 3 days of careful observation revealed layers of complexity in the girl's existence that challenged every assumption Silas had formed about wilderness survival and human nature. Her territory, as he had come to think of it, extended far beyond the meadow where they had first met, encompassing a sophisticated network of shelter sites, food caches, and strategic positions that spoke of years spent developing intimate knowledge of this particular section of mountain forest. The most remarkable discovery was a series of stone cairns she had constructed at key points throughout her range, carefully balanced towers of rocks that served as both territorial markers and communication devices. Each cairn contained specific arrangements that clearly held meaning within the pack's social structure, though deciphering their significance required observation of behaviors that operated according to logic entirely different from human reasoning. On their second morning together, the girl led Silas and Rex to one of these cairns, positioned on a rocky outcrop that commanded views of 3 separate valleys. She approached the stone marker with obvious reverence, adding a new rock to its summit while making soft sounds that brought her pack to respectful attention. The ritual had the formal dignity of religious observance, suggesting that her relationship with this territory went beyond mere survival to encompass spiritual and emotional connections that most humans reserved for sacred spaces. Rex, meanwhile, had been accepted into the pack's daily routines with surprising ease. The big husky's training and intelligence allowed him to interpret their subtle communications, while his natural pack instincts helped him understand hierarchies and social dynamics that operated on principles he recognized even if the specific behaviors were unfamiliar. Watching him interact with the wild animals, Silas began to understand how his own relationship with his sled team had prepared Rex for this kind of interspecies cooperation. The girl's reaction to Rex's integration was equally fascinating. She studied the bond between dog and human with intense curiosity, clearly recognizing something familiar yet different from her own relationships with her pack. When Silas used whistle commands to direct Rex's movements, she watched with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a new form of magic. Occasionally, making her own experimental sounds to see if they would produce similar responses. Her attempts at human speech began on the third day, starting with careful mimicry of simple sounds. Silas repeated patiently. "Silas," she would say, the syllables strange on her tongue, followed by the clicking sounds that seemed to be her pack's word for the tall human who had entered their world. Her voice was rough from disuse and exposure, but unmistakably intelligent, suggesting that the capacity for human language remained intact, despite years of relying on entirely different communication methods. Progress was frustratingly slow, tempered by the girl's obvious discomfort with sounds that felt foreign and unnatural after so many years of pack communication. But her determination was remarkable, and by the fourth day she had mastered several basic words: Rex, water, food, though she pronounced each with careful deliberation, as if afraid they might disappear if not handled properly. The breakthrough came when she began to understand that human words could describe concepts her pack communications couldn't easily express. The word yesterday fascinated her, representing a way of thinking about time that her survival-focused existence rarely required. She practiced the sound repeatedly, then began using it to describe events in ways that suggested she was learning to organize her experiences according to human frameworks of memory and sequence. Silas found himself becoming teacher as much as observer, responding to her obvious hunger for new forms of understanding. He named objects, demonstrated relationships, and gradually introduced concepts that bridged the gap between her pack-based worldview and the human society that had created the language she was struggling to reclaim. Her intelligence was formidable, processing new information with the rapid efficiency of someone whose survival had always depended on quick learning and accurate assessment. But for every step forward in human communication, the girl demonstrated equal sophistication in her pack relationships. Her ability to coordinate group hunting strategies surpassed anything Silas had observed in his years of watching wildlife. She could position her pack members with subtle gestures, coordinate timing through vocalizations that carried complex information, and adapt tactics based on real-time assessment of changing conditions. Watching her hunt was like observing a masterclass in wilderness strategy. She understood wind patterns, animal psychology, terrain advantages, and group dynamics in ways that would have impressed the most experienced guides. Her pack responded to her leadership with the kind of trust that came from repeated success and mutual respect, following directions that often contradicted their individual instincts, because experience had taught them that her human intelligence could identify opportunities they might miss. One afternoon, while demonstrating how to construct snares using plant fibers, the girl began what could only be described as storytelling, using a combination of gestures, vocalizations, and primitive drawings scratched in the dirt. She recounted what appeared to be the history of her pack, how individual members had joined the group, where they had traveled during particularly harsh winters, and which hunting grounds had proven most reliable over the years. The stories revealed a social memory that extended far beyond her own experience, suggesting that her pack maintained oral traditions passed down through generations of successful survival. She was not just a member of this community, but its historian and strategist, responsible for preserving knowledge that kept them all alive. The realization hit Silas with unexpected force. Removing her from this environment wouldn't just disrupt her own life, but would rob her pack of accumulated wisdom that might be irreplaceable. As days passed, he began to observe signs of her growing internal conflict. She was clearly fascinated by the human elements Rex and Silas represented, drawn to communication methods and relationship patterns that awakened memories or instincts she couldn't quite articulate. But every step toward human understanding seemed to create corresponding anxiety about her place within the pack structure that had defined her existence for so many years. Her pack sensed this tension and responded with protective behaviors that spoke of deep emotional bonds. They positioned themselves closer to her during rest periods, increased their territorial vigilance, and displayed heightened attention to her moods and reactions. Their behavior suggested they understood, perhaps better than she did herself, that forces beyond their control were working to separate their family unit. The stone cairn on the rocky outcrop became the focal point of these tensions. Each morning, the girl would climb to its position and spend long minutes arranging and rearranging the rocks, as if trying to balance competing forces through physical manipulation of the markers that anchored her to this place. Silas would watch these morning rituals and feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like snow that grew heavier. With each passing day, he was witnessing something unprecedented, a human being who had achieved perfect adaptation to wilderness life while maintaining the intelligence and emotional depth that marked her species. The question that haunted him was whether his presence here represented opportunity or catastrophe, salvation or destruction for a life that worked beautifully according to its own terms, but might not survive contact with the civilization that had failed to protect her in the first place. The girl's growing facility with human language brought unexpected revelations that shattered Silas's assumptions about her origins and identity. On their 7th day together, as she practiced forming words with increasing confidence, she began to share fragments of memory that painted a picture far more complex than simple abandonment or accidental loss. "Mother," she said one afternoon, the word carrying weight that spoke of genuine recollection rather than abstract concept. She followed it with a series of sounds from her pack language, then attempted to bridge the gap between the two communication systems. "Mother, away, cold time, big snow." Through patient questioning and careful interpretation of her mixed linguistic responses, Silas began to piece together a story that challenged his understanding of how she had come to live with the wild pack. Her memories suggested she hadn't been lost or abandoned in the conventional sense, but had been deliberately placed in the wilderness during what sounded like a catastrophic winter, perhaps by someone who believed the forest offered better survival chances than whatever human situation had become untenable. The implications were staggering. Someone had made the desperate decision to trust her survival to the wilderness rather than to human institutions or communities. That decision had proved remarkably prescient, given her obvious health and competence, but it raised questions about what circumstances could have driven such an extreme choice. Silas found himself wondering about the unnamed woman who had possessed both the wilderness, knowledge to make such placement possible, and the courage to trust nature over civilization. With her child's life, as her vocabulary expanded, the girl began to reveal more sophisticated aspects of her pack's social structure. They weren't simply a collection of animals that had accepted a human member, but a deliberately constructed family unit with assigned roles, shared responsibilities, and complex decision-making processes that incorporated her human intelligence into canine social frameworks. "Pack leader," she explained, indicating the silver-gray male who had first greeted Rex. "Decides hunt time, save time, move time, but asks Echo first." Echo, he realized, was what they called her, a name that captured her unique position as the one who could process information in ways the others couldn't, then reflect it back in forms they could understand and act upon. Her role within the pack extended far beyond simple membership to encompass strategic planning that utilized her capacity for abstract thinking and long-term analysis. She could predict weather patterns by observing subtle environmental changes, anticipate animal movements by understanding migration timing, and identify potential threats by recognizing patterns that might not be obvious to creatures focused on immediate sensory input. This revelation forced Silas to reconsider everything about her situation. She wasn't a victim who had somehow managed to survive despite terrible circumstances, but an integral component of a highly successful survival system that had evolved over years of mutual adaptation. Her pack needed her intelligence as much as she needed their protection and companionship. creating interdependencies that went far beyond simple emotional attachment. The afternoon brought visitors that tested everyone's diplomatic skills and highlighted the complex territorial relationships that governed life in these mountains. A family of black bears approached the pack's temporary camp, drawn by a sense of recent hunting success, but clearly uncertain about the unusual composition of the group they encountered. Silas watched in fascination as the girl took point in managing this potentially dangerous situation. She positioned her pack in defensive formations while using her own body language to communicate non-aggressive intent to the bears. Her vocalizations included elements that seemed designed to appeal to unseen social instincts, while her movements demonstrated the kind of confident calm that predators respected, regardless of species. The negotiation, for that was clearly what it was, lasted nearly an hour. The girl shared portions of her pack's recent kills while establishing clear boundaries about access to their camp area. The bears accepted the offering with the dignified restraint of creatures who understood they were being granted a favor rather than capitulating to demands. When they finally withdrew, both sides had maintained face while avoiding conflict that could have been catastrophic for the smaller, less physically powerful pack. Bears people, the girl explained afterward, using a construction that revealed how her worldview organized different species into categories of relationship rather than simple threat assessment. Same us. Need food, need safe place, need family. Give respect, get respect. This philosophy extended to every aspect of her pack's territorial management. They had developed relationships with various animal communities based on mutual benefit rather than simple dominance or avoidance. Certain bird species served as early warning systems in exchange for protection during nesting season. Smaller predators like foxes and martens were tolerated in specific areas where their hunting didn't compete with pack activities. Even potentially dangerous species like mountain lions received careful diplomatic treatment that prevented territorial conflicts while maintaining essential boundaries. Rex's integration into these complex relationships proved his remarkable adaptability and intelligence. Within days, he had learned to interpret the subtle signals that indicated how to behave around different species, when to show deference, when to assert pack authority, and when to simply remain neutral. His training with Silas had prepared him for taking direction from pack leaders, but his natural intelligence allowed him to understand social dynamics that operated according to wilderness rules rather than human commands. The girl's fascination with Rex's obedience training continued to grow, and she began experimenting with applying human-style commands to her own pack relationships. The results were mixed, but illuminating. Her pack members could learn to respond to vocal signals, but their responses reflected their own decision-making processes rather than the automatic compliance Rex had been trained to provide. This difference seemed to frustrate and intrigue her in equal measure. She would spend long periods observing the interactions between Silas and Rex, clearly trying to understand how relationships could function when one participant voluntarily surrendered autonomy to another. The concept of choosing subordination for mutual benefit was familiar to her through pack hierarchies, but the human canine version operated according to principles that challenged her understanding of how intelligence should be applied to survival situations. As evening approached, on their 8th day together, the girl made a decision that surprised everyone. She approached Silas with deliberate formality and spoke a single word that carried unmistakable meaning, despite her still limited vocabulary. "Come," she said, gesturing toward a section of forest they had not yet explored together. Her pack arranged themselves in traveling formation, clearly prepared for a journey of some significance. Rex looked to Silas for guidance, while the wild animals waited with the patient attention of creatures who understood they were about to undertake something important. The invitation represented a level of trust and inclusion that Silas hadn't dared hope for But it also suggested that the girl had reached some internal decision about the future of their strange alliance. As they moved deeper into her territory, following trails known only to her and her pack, he wondered whether she was leading them toward greater understanding or toward a revelation that would force choices none of them were prepared to make. The journey through increasingly dense forest led them to a hidden valley that existed like a secret within the already remote wilderness. Ancient glacial activity had carved this sanctuary from the living rock, creating natural walls that rose on three sides, while the fourth opened onto a view of distant peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. Here, sheltered from the worst weather and hidden from casual discovery, lay the true heart of Echo's territory. But it was what occupied the center of this hidden valley that stopped Silas's heart entirely. The remains of a cabin stood among the towering pines. Its log walls weathered but intact, its stone chimney still pointing toward the sky like an accusation. This wasn't the crude shelter of a desperate survivor, but the careful construction of someone who had planned to live here permanently, someone who had chosen this isolation deliberately and built accordingly. The structure showed signs of recent use, repairs made with the kind of materials and techniques that spoke of ongoing habitation rather than abandonment. Echo approached the cabin with obvious familiarity, her pack spreading out to check the perimeter with the practiced efficiency of creatures returning to a known safe haven. She paused at the wooden door, her hand resting on timber that had been smoothed by years of handling, and looked back at Silas with an expression that mixed pride with something that might have been apprehension. "Home," she said simply, then added sounds in her pack language that brought immediate responses from her companions. Whatever she had told them, it was clearly permission to relax their vigilance and settle into routines they knew well. The interior of the cabin revealed secrets that turned everything Silas thought he knew about Echo's situation completely upside down. The single room was organized with meticulous care, showing evidence of someone who understood both wilderness living and domestic comfort. Carved furniture displayed craftsmanship that spoke of patience and skill, while carefully preserved books lined shelves built into the log walls with architectural precision that suggested professional knowledge. But it was the collection of small items arranged on a table near the window that made Silas's knees weak with recognition and disbelief. Children's toys, carved from local wood with obvious love and attention to detail. A doll with carefully stitched clothing and hair made from plant fibers. Wooden blocks with letters carefully burned into their surfaces. And in the center of this display, a small rocking horse that bore the unmistakable marks of expert craftsmanship and years of gentle use. His hands shook as he approached the table, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. The carving style, the attention to detail, the specific techniques used to join wood and create moving parts, all of it was familiar because he had seen this work before, had held these very pieces in his own hands during the desperate years when he had searched every trail, questioned every stranger, followed every possible lead in his hunt for his missing daughter. "Maggie," he whispered, the name torn from his throat like a physical wound. Echo's reaction was immediate and startling. She spun toward him with eyes wide, her pack coming instantly alert at the change in her posture and vocal tone. For a moment, the cabin filled with tension that spoke of fight or flight responses activated by unknown threats. But then Echo stepped forward, her hand reaching towards Silas with tentative hope rather than fear. "Maggie," she repeated carefully, pronouncing each syllable as if testing its weight and meaning, her eyes fixed on his face with desperate intensity. "Maggie, daughter." The word hit him like a physical blow, but not the casual use of vocabulary she had been practicing. This was recognition, memory, a connection to concepts and relationships that existed far beyond her wilderness education. She knew what daughter meant not from his teaching, but from some deeper understanding that predated her pack life. "Papa," she asked, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of 15 years of buried hope and desperate longing. The cabin walls seemed to close in around Silas as the full implications crashed through his consciousness like an avalanche. This wasn't some random wild child he had discovered by chance. This was his daughter, his Maggie, who had somehow survived not just being lost, but had thrived in circumstances that should have meant certain death. The girl he had searched for until it nearly destroyed him. The child whose disappearance had driven him into these mountains to heal or die, had been living here all along, building a life and family that operated according to rules he was only beginning to understand. But even as joy and relief flooded through him, darker realizations followed. The cabin's location, its careful construction, the evidence of long-term habitation, none of this supported the simple story of a lost child who had somehow survived through luck and animal kindness. Someone had brought her here deliberately, someone who possessed both the wilderness skills to make such isolation survivable, and the knowledge to teach a 7-year-old enough survival techniques to transition into pack life when human guidance was no longer available. Maggie moved through the cabin with obvious familiarity, showing him details that painted a picture of careful preparation and deliberate choice. A root cellar stocked with preserved foods, tools and weapons designed for someone smaller than adult size but built to last for years. Books selected not just for entertainment but for education, covering everything from practical wilderness skills to philosophy and poetry that would nourish a developing mind. "Mother," Maggie said again, but this time she moved to a particular spot near the fireplace and knelt to remove a loose floorboard. From the hidden space beneath, she withdrew a collection of items that told a story Silas had never imagined possible. Letters, written in Sarah's careful handwriting, addressed to their daughter but never sent. A photograph of their family taken just months before Maggie's disappearance, showing the three of them together with expressions of happiness that seemed to belong to different people entirely. And most shocking of all, a journal in Sarah's hand that chronicled decisions and preparations that revealed the true story of what had happened during those desperate years when their marriage had fallen apart and their family had shattered. The journal's contents, read by flickering firelight while Maggie's pack settled into evening routines around them, revealed a truth that challenged everything Silas had believed about his wife, his daughter, and the tragic events that had driven him into exile. Sarah hadn't simply left him because she couldn't bear his obsessive searching. She'd been making preparations of her own, following leads he had never known existed, and ultimately making a choice so desperate and courageous that it defied every assumption about motherhood, survival, and the lengths to which love could drive human behavior. The final entry, dated just days before Sarah's departure from their home, explained everything with brutal clarity. "I can't tell him what I've learned, what I've discovered about who took her and why. He would try to stop me, or worse, try to help in ways that would only get us all killed. But I know where she is now, and I know what I have to do. If this works, if I can get her somewhere safe until she's old enough to choose for herself, then maybe someday they can find each other again. If it doesn't work, at least I'll die trying to save her instead of waiting for someone else to bring her home." The night passed in fragments of revelation and recognition as father and daughter began the delicate process of rebuilding connections that had been severed by 15 years of separation and circumstances neither had chosen. Maggie moved through the cabin with growing confidence, showing Silas details of her life that painted a picture of remarkable adaptation and survival, while he struggled to reconcile the wild, capable young woman before him with the 7-year-old child who lived in his memories. Sarah's journal provided the framework for understanding, but the emotional reality proved far more complex than any written account could capture. As Maggie's human vocabulary returned with surprising speed, aided by books and written materials she had preserved but rarely used, she began to share memories that filled in gaps the journal couldn't address. Her recall of those early months was fragmentary but vivid, fear and confusion giving way to gradual understanding as her mother taught her skills that would keep her alive when human protection was no longer possible. Mother stayed, Maggie explained in her careful, still developing speech, until cold time passed. Taught me how to be safe, how to find food, how to speak with pack family. Then Mother said, had to go away, had to keep bad people from finding this place. The bad people, according to both Sarah's journal and Maggie's recovered memories, had been the reason for this desperate relocation in the first place. Not random kidnappers motivated by ransom or opportunistic predators, but something far more systematic and dangerous. A network that trafficked in children for purposes that made the wilderness seem like sanctuary by comparison. Sarah had discovered evidence of this network during her own investigation into Maggie's disappearance, finding connections and patterns that law enforcement had missed or chosen to ignore. The decision to fake Maggie's death and relocate her to the wilderness hadn't been abandonment, but the most desperate form of protection. A mother's choice to trust nature over a human society that had failed to keep her child safe. Sarah had spent months preparing this refuge, learning wilderness skills, establishing relationships with people who could provide supplies without asking questions, and gradually teaching Maggie the competencies she would need to survive in an environment that was harsh but predictable in its dangers. Mother said, Maggie continued, her words growing more fluent as buried linguistic patterns reasserted themselves. Someday, when bad people gone, when Echo grown strong enough to choose, then maybe could find Papa again. Mother promised would try to come back. But winter came early that year, and Mother got sick. The rest of that story emerged through careful questioning and gentle encouragement as Maggie worked through memories that carried pain despite the years that had softened their immediate impact. Sarah had indeed become ill during what should have been her final winter in the mountains, a respiratory infection that progressed too quickly for the limited medical resources available in such isolation. Her death had left 8-year-old Maggie alone with survival skills that proved adequate for wilderness living, but no way to navigate back to human civilization. The pack that became her family had found her during that winter of grief and transition, drawn initially by the sense of her mother's final illness, but remaining because of something unprecedented. A young human who could communicate with them, who possessed intelligence they could recognize and utilize, who needed protection they could provide while offering strategic thinking that enhanced their own survival capabilities. Pack leader came first, Maggie explained, indicating the silver-gray male, who now rested peacefully near the cabin's fireplace. Was young then, not much bigger than me. Both of us lost family, both scared, but together was better than alone. The relationship had evolved over years of mutual dependence and shared challenges, each species contributing strengths that compensated for the other's limitations. Maggie's human intelligence allowed for long-term planning, tool use, and abstract thinking that enhanced hunting success and territory management. The pack provided protection, companionship, and access to sensory information that kept them all safe from threats human senses couldn't detect. But now, with Silas's arrival and the return of human language and concepts, that carefully balanced system faced unprecedented challenges. Maggie's growing facility with human communication brought back not just vocabulary, but ways of thinking that had been dormant for years. She began to remember not just her life before the mountains, but dreams and aspirations that had been put aside in favor of survival priorities. Sometimes, she admitted during one of their long conversations, when reading Mother's books, I remember wanting to be teacher like Mother was, wanting to have house with windows and garden, wanting to wear pretty dresses and learn piano music, her expression mixed longing with confusion. But that was little girl dreams. Now I'm pack leader, responsible for family safety, cannot leave them. The conflict between these two identities, Echo the pack strategist and Maggie the human daughter, became more pronounced as each day passed. Rex's presence complicated matters further, demonstrating possibilities for connection between human and canine worlds that neither fully domestic nor fully wild relationships could achieve. Watching Silas and Rex work together, Maggie began to envision hybrid solutions that might allow her to maintain pack connections while exploring human potentials. She had nearly forgotten. Silas found himself walking an emotional tightrope between joy at finding his daughter alive and healthy and growing understanding of how complex any attempt at reunion would prove. The remarkable young woman Maggie had become bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old he had lost, and attempting to force her back into patterns that had been interrupted 15 years ago would likely destroy the very qualities that had enabled her survival and growth. More troubling was his gradual realization that the network Sarah had fled might still pose threats. Her journal referenced ongoing investigations, people who had been asking questions, and warnings about maintaining absolute secrecy regarding Maggie's location and survival. Bringing her back to civilization might expose her to the very dangers Sarah had died trying to prevent, while keeping her hidden meant asking her to abandon dreams and possibilities that were finally beginning to resurface. The weight of these decisions pressed on both of them as they worked. Through the practical implications of their reunion, Maggie's pack sensed the growing tension and responded with increased protective behaviors that spoke of their own anxiety about potential changes to their family structure. They had accepted Silas's presence because Maggie welcomed it, but their body language made clear that any attempt to remove her from their territory would be met with fierce resistance. On their 4th day at the cabin, while exploring the extensive cave system that provided winter shelter and storage space, they discovered evidence that forced urgent reconsideration of their timeline for decision-making. Recent signs of human presence, boot prints in mud that hadn't had time to weather, camping debris that couldn't be more than days old, and most alarming of all, surveying equipment that suggested professional rather than recreational interest in this remote location. Someone's been looking, Silas realized, his mountain-trained eyes reading the subtle signs of intrusion and investigation. Recently, and they were thorough enough to find places I wouldn't have thought to check. Maggie's pack had detected these intrusions as well, which explained their heightened alert behaviors over the past weeks. They had been trying to warn her that their sanctuary was no longer secure, that forces beyond their understanding or control were closing in on the safe territory that had protected them for so many years. The discovery forced a conversation that neither father nor daughter felt prepared for, but which circumstances now demanded. They could no longer afford the luxury of gradual adjustment and careful planning. Whether the intrusions represented government agencies, private investigators, or something more sinister connected to the original network Sarah had fled, their presence meant that decisions about Maggie's future had to be made immediately rather than eventually. "Cannot run again," Maggie said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had successfully managed life and death decisions for years. "Pack too old now for long travel. Territory too good to abandon without fight. If bad people come, we face them here where know every rock, every trail, every hiding place." Silas looked at his daughter, this remarkable young woman who had survived impossible circumstances and built a life that worked according to its own terms, and felt the full weight of choices that would determine not just her future, but the survival of the pack family that had raised her, and the preservation of secrets that Sarah had died to protect. Tomorrow would bring decisions that couldn't be undone, confrontations that couldn't be avoided, and consequences that would ripple through lives that had already endured more disruption than any family should have to bear. Dawn brought the confrontation they had dreaded but expected, announced not by human sounds, but by the sudden silence that fell over the forest when predators recognized the approach of something that didn't belong. Maggie's pack responded to this unnatural quiet with coordinated alertness that spoke of years spent reading environmental cues for survival. Information. 3 men emerged from the tree line, with the confident movements of people who believed they held all the advantages. They wore expensive outdoor gear that marked them as well-funded, but carried weapons with the casual familiarity that suggested violence was their preferred method of problem-solving. Their leader, a tall man with eyes that missed nothing, surveyed the cabin and its surroundings with obvious satisfaction. "Margaret Sarah Boone," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with practiced authority. "Also known as Echo. We've been looking for you for a very long time." The use of her full name, including the middle name that appeared only on official documents, confirmed Silas's worst fears about who these men represented and how thoroughly they had researched their target. This wasn't random discovery, but the culmination of an investigation that had been ongoing despite Sarah's efforts to erase all traces of their daughter's survival. Maggie stepped onto the cabin's porch with the fluid confidence of someone moving through familiar territory, her pack arranging themselves in protective positions that utilized every advantage the terrain offered. Rex positioned himself beside Silas, while the wild animals seemed to melt into shadows that would allow them to attack from unexpected angles. "You're on private property," Silas called back, his rifle ready but not yet aimed, hoping that civilian authority might carry weight with people who had obviously operated outside legal constraints for years. The leader's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Mr. Silas Boone, the grieving father who never stopped searching. How touching that you finally found what you were looking for. Unfortunately, you've discovered something that doesn't belong to you anymore." He gestured to his companions, who began moving to flank the cabin with tactical precision that spoke of military training applied to criminal purposes. "Margaret is valuable property, Mr. Boone. She represents an investment that has been carefully protected and monitored for 15 years. Her mother may have thought she could hide the merchandise permanently, but we have resources that don't give up easily." The casual reference to his daughter as merchandise ignited fury in Silas that burned away fear and caution. But before he could respond, Maggie spoke with a voice that carried absolute authority, despite her careful pronunciation of words she was still reclaiming. "Am not property," she said clearly. "Am Echo, pack leader, daughter of mountains. You not welcome in my territory." Her pack responded to some signal Silas couldn't detect, flowing into attack positions with silent coordination that transformed them from domestic animals into apex predators. Operating according to wilderness rules, these men couldn't possibly understand. The contrast between the intruders' technological advantages and the pack's environmental mastery created a standoff that balanced on knife-edge tension. "We're not here to negotiate," the leader replied, pulling a tranquilizer gun that suggested they wanted her alive rather than simply eliminated. "You're coming with us, Margaret. Whether that happens easily or with maximum trauma to everyone present is entirely up to you." But the man had made a critical error in his assessment of the tactical situation. He had focused on human elements, Silas's rifle, Maggie's compliance or resistance, while ignoring the pack dynamics that made this territory far more dangerous than it appeared. When Maggie made a sound that was neither human nor fully animal, her packmates responded with coordinated precision that turned the clearing into chaos. The silver-gray pack leader launched himself at the nearest flanking attacker, while two others moved to cut off retreat routes the men hadn't even identified. Rex, trained for different purposes but possessed of natural intelligence and loyalty, positioned himself to protect Silas while maintaining awareness of threats from multiple directions. But it was Maggie herself who proved most formidable, moving through the developing conflict with strategic awareness that utilized every advantage her unique upbringing had provided. She understood both human weapon capabilities and pack-fighting techniques, allowing her to coordinate responses that maximized her family's strengths while exploiting the intruders' assumptions about what they were facing. The leader managed to fire his tranquilizer gun, but Maggie had already moved beyond his targeting assumptions. Flowing through terrain, he couldn't navigate with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to think like water, moving downhill. His shot went wide, striking a tree trunk where she should have been, but wasn't. Silas found himself part of a battle that operated according to rules he barely understood, where human technology met wilderness adaptation in a contest that would determine not just immediate survival, but whether the life Sarah had died to protect could continue to exist on its own terms. The sound of Rex's warning bark, sharp and urgent, announced the arrival of additional complications that would test every survival skill and family bond that 15 years of mountain living had created. Rex's warning announced the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradshaw and 2 federal agents whose presence transformed the tactical situation from criminal confrontation to legal complexity that none of the original combatants had anticipated. The lawmen emerged from the forest with weapons drawn, but held low, their positioning suggesting they had been observing the developing conflict while waiting for the optimal moment to intervene. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying authority that made the criminal leader's confident demeanor evaporate instantly. "Everyone lower your weapons and step away from each other, now." The 3 criminals found themselves caught between pack attacks they couldn't counter and legal authority they couldn't fight, their carefully planned operation collapsing into chaos as wilderness tactics met law enforcement coordination. The leader's tranquilizer gun suddenly seemed inadequate against threats from multiple directions, while his companions discovered that routes they had scouted were now blocked by federal agents who had obviously been tracking their movements for some time. But the most remarkable transformation was in Maggie herself, who seemed to shift between her pack identity and emerging human awareness as circumstances demanded different kinds of strategic thinking. She called her packmates back from their attacks with sounds that combined human words and canine communication, demonstrating control that impressed even the experienced lawmen who were witnessing pack dynamics they had never imagined possible. "Echo," she told her pack family, her voice carrying calm authority despite the chaos surrounding them. "Safe now, good pack. Stand down." Sheriff Bradshaw, a weathered man whose 40 years of mountain law enforcement had prepared him for unusual situations, approached Silas with careful respect for the firearms still present and the obvious emotional intensity of the reunion he was interrupting. "Mr. Boone," he said quietly, "we've been investigating these people for 3 years. Your wife left information with federal authorities before she died, insurance policies that led us to this network and eventually to this location. We've been waiting for them to make their move so we could arrest them with sufficient evidence for conviction." The revelation that Sarah had planned even beyond her own death, that she had provided law enforcement with tools to eventually dismantle the network that had threatened their family, added another layer of complexity to decisions about Maggie's future. Her mother's foresight had created the possibility for justice, but it had also exposed the mountain sanctuary to scrutiny that would make continued isolation impossible. Federal Agent Williams, a competent woman whose manner suggested extensive experience with trafficking cases, approached Maggie with the careful respect due to someone who had survived trauma that most people couldn't imagine. "Margaret, we know what you've been through, and we know how you've survived. You're not in any trouble, and nobody is going to force you to do anything you don't want to do. But we need to talk about options for your future that take into account both your safety and your obvious, unique circumstances." Maggie studied the federal agent with the same intense assessment she applied to all new situations, reading body language and vocal tones for information about intentions and threat levels. Her pack maintained protective positions, but showed none of the aggressive posturing they had displayed toward the criminals. Apparently able to distinguish between different kinds of human authority. "Have lived here 15 years, Maggie said carefully, her improving vocabulary allowing for more complex communication about complicated subjects. "Have pack family territory responsibilities. Cannot simply leave because humans say must leave. The standoff that developed wasn't between opposing forces, but between competing definitions of what constituted family, safety, and legitimate authority. The federal agents needed to process a criminal case that had taken years to develop. Sheriff Bradshaw had to manage jurisdictional issues in territory that technically fell under his authority, but operated according to rules he had never encountered. And Silas faced the impossible choice between protecting his daughter's freedom and ensuring her safety in a world that might never understand or accept the life she had built. It was Rex who provided the catalyst for resolution, demonstrating once again the intelligence that had made him such an effective bridge between human and pack worlds. The big husky moved deliberately between the federal agents and Maggie's pack, positioning himself where he could communicate with both groups while maintaining neutrality that neither side could interpret as threatening. His own behavior suggested possibilities that none of the humans had considered, ways that Maggie's unique situation might serve purposes beyond simple survival, opportunities for her pack-based knowledge to contribute to understanding that could benefit both human and animal communities. Agent Williams, trained to recognize unusual assets when she encountered them, began to ask questions that opened doors to solutions none of them had imagined. Margaret, what you've accomplished here, the relationships you've built, the survival techniques you've mastered. There are people in wildlife management, in animal behavior research, in wilderness education, who could learn incredible amounts from your experience. Would you be interested in sharing that knowledge while maintaining the connections that matter to you? The possibility that her wilderness expertise might have value beyond simple survival, that the life she had built could serve purposes larger than personal safety, offered Maggie something she had never considered, a way to honor both her human potential and her pack loyalties without having to choose between them. 2 years later, the mountain sanctuary had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of wildlife management, a research station where interspecies communication and wilderness survival techniques were studied by scientists and educators who came from around the world to learn from a young woman whose unique experiences offered insights that no textbook could provide. Maggie, now 18 and confident in both her pack identity and her human heritage, moved between worlds with the fluid grace that had always marked her adaptation to challenging circumstances. She spent her mornings working with her pack to demonstrate hunting strategies and territorial management techniques that revolutionized understanding of predator behavior. Her afternoons were devoted to teaching wilderness survival skills that combined traditional knowledge with innovations, born from necessity and refined. Through years of successful application, the cabin had been expanded into a comfortable research facility that honored both human needs and pack dynamics, with indoor spaces for formal education and outdoor areas where Maggie's packmates could maintain their natural behaviors while participating in studies that enhanced scientific understanding of animal intelligence and social structures. The stone cairns that marked her territory had become waypoints on carefully designed trails that allowed visitors to observe pack behaviors without disrupting the family. Relationships that remained central to her identity. Rex had become something of a celebrity himself, demonstrating the possibilities for sophisticated interspecies cooperation while serving as ambassador between domestic and wild canine communities. His intelligence and training allowed him to translate between human commands and pack communication, creating bridges that benefited everyone involved. Watching him work with Maggie's pack, visitors gained new appreciation for the cognitive abilities of animals and the potential for relationships that transcended traditional boundaries. Between tame and wild, Silas had found purpose he had never expected. In his role as facility coordinator, using his mountain expertise to manage the practical aspects of research station operations, while supporting his daughter's work without interfering with the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. Their relationship had developed into something deeper than the father-daughter bond they had lost 15 years ago, a partnership between adults who respected each other's choices while cherishing the family. Connection that had survived impossible circumstances. The wooden whistle that had first brought them together still hung around his neck, but now it served new purposes in the communication systems Maggie had developed for managing complex interactions between human visitors and pack members who remained fundamentally wild despite their educational roles. The sound patterns they had refined could convey information across distances and between species, creating protocols that ensured everyone's safety while maximizing learning opportunities. The legal resolution of the criminal network had taken 18 months of careful prosecution, during which Maggie's testimony via video link had proven crucial in securing convictions that protected other potential victims while honoring her preference for remaining in the mountain sanctuary that had saved her life. Agent Williams had become a regular visitor, often bringing law enforcement personnel who needed training in wilderness survival and animal behavior for their own protection and effectiveness. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been the gradual emergence of Maggie's own voice as an advocate for wilderness preservation and alternative approaches to education. Her writing, published in journals that reached audiences from elementary students to university researchers, combined scientific observation with personal narrative in ways that made complex concepts accessible while maintaining the emotional authenticity that marked her unique perspective. Learning doesn't happen only in classrooms, she had written in her most recent article. Some of the most important lessons come from relationships that cross species boundaries, from accepting that intelligence takes many forms, and from understanding that family can be created through choice and mutual support, rather than just biology and tradition. The pack that had raised her remained central to everything she accomplished, their presence lending authenticity to research that might otherwise have been dismissed as theoretical speculation. Watching her work with animals who trusted her completely, visitors gained new understanding of what was possible when respect replaced dominance and cooperation superseded control. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Silas of the day he had first followed Rex into the forest, father and daughter stood together on the cabin porch, watching her pack settle into evening routines that had remained unchanged despite all the developments around them. The silver-gray pack leader, now showing his age but still commanding respect, rested beside the stone fireplace, while younger pack members maintained the territorial vigilance that kept their sanctuaries secure. "Do you ever wonder," Silas asked quietly, "what your mother would think of all this? The research station, the work you're doing, the way you've found purpose that honors both parts of your identity?" Maggie considered the question with the thoughtful intensity that marked all her responses to complex issues. Her fingers unconsciously traced the carved toys that still occupied places of honor in the cabin, artifacts that connected her to the little girl she had been while celebrating the remarkable woman she had become. "I think," she said finally, "that Mother would be proud we found a way to make her sacrifice meaningful. She saved my life, but what we've built here gives that life purpose beyond just survival. The pack taught me about loyalty and cooperation. You taught me about love that doesn't give up. Together we've created something that helps other people understand what's possible when different kinds of families work together." Rex settled beside them with the contented sigh of a dog whose day had been full of purpose and accomplishment, while the wild pack members arranged themselves in protective positions that had become second nature over years of shared living. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, promising sanctuary to those strong enough to meet their terms while offering lessons that no civilization could duplicate. As stars emerged in the darkening sky, the research station settled into the peaceful rhythms that marked successful adaptation to wilderness life, proof that sometimes the most broken families could heal in ways that created possibilities no one had dared imagine. The lost had indeed been found, but in forms that transformed both seeker and sought, creating new definitions of home, family, and the courage required to live authentically in a world that rarely offered second chances as profound as this one.